This is Matt, and these are the vintage vinyl albums for January 2020. The debut album from Forbidden doesn't always get the same accolades given to the more popular releases from their Bay Area peers. But it's a classic in its own right, bringing the power-laden thrash metal onslaught through 8 crushing tracks. Originally formed in 1985 by guitarist Rob Flynn, later of Violence, and later than that Machine Head, the band was then known as Forbidden Evil, but they shortened their name to Forbidden in 1987 to avoid being perceived as a black metal band, or at least what was assumed to be black metal back then. Of course, they didn't get rid of the name completely because it became the album title. So maybe that makes the name switch explanation a tad confusing? Also on the record is drummer Paul Bostaff, who's also known for being in Testament and Exodus, and much better known for his 2-part tenure in Slayer. He's as you'd imagine on this album, tight, fast, and diverse. And of course, there's Forbidden singer Russ Anderson, whose siren's wail of a voice falls in similar company to that of Rob Halford and Joey Belladonna. Although some thrash purists might disagree, I feel that the vocals work surprisingly well with the material. Definitely some real talent from all involved. Standout tracks include Forbidden Evil, Through Eyes of Glass, and especially Chalice of Blood.
Welcome to the Church of Lies! Chalice of Blood! Waits to feel lost! Chalice of Blood!
The album art of Forbidden Evil was done by Kent Matthew, who's also done covers for such bands as Possessed, Ex-Hoarder, and Artillery, to name a few. Matthew would also go on to illustrate other Forbidden albums. 4 in total, actually. If wanting to see Forbidden live footage, you should definitely track down the 1989 home video release of Ultimate Revenge 2, which also features live sets from Dark Angel, Death, Faith or Fear, and Raven, all of whom taped in October 1988. As of this recording, it seems that there are 2 vinyl reissues out there for Forbidden Evil. The first in 2008 by Back on Black Records on green splatter vinyl, and the second by the Greek label Flogger Records in 2016. One on blue vinyl and limited to 350 copies, and one on black vinyl with a gatefold and limited to 150 copies. Sadly, we haven't heard much from Forbidden since the 2010 release of Omega Wave. Not having played live since 2012, they're assumed inactive at best, or broken up at worst. Despite the obstacles of getting back together, I hope a comeback happens. Let me know if you feel the same, or even not, in the comments below. Although this is the fan favorite album, I'm a little more partial to their follow-up record, Twisted into Form, which shows a bit more musical growth for the band. Either way, you can't go wrong with either one. The 7th album from Krokus sits neatly between a number of their hard rock offerings before it and their attempt at more mainstream pop metal after. Widely considered the apex of their fairly long career, Headhunter really sticks out in their catalog for its sheer heaviness and its solid tracks. In addition to scoring a simple and yet insanely iconic album cover image, Krokus also managed to enlist the services of producer Tom Allom. You remember Allom. In addition to working with Judas Priest and Def Leppard, he also produced Headhunter and did a hell of a great job on it. The mix is fantastic, and it captures Krokus at their undeniable best. On previous efforts, Krokus really got pegged as an AC/DC knockoff, and on some of the older material, that's pretty dead on. And while some of that influence has a very slight appearance here, I just don't hear as much AC/DC worship as others might on this specific album. Of course, feel free to argue for or against that in the comments below. Preferred tracks are a toss-up between Ready to Burn and the title track to Headhunter. Music videos were made for both Eat the Rich and Screaming in the Night, both of which, along with their cover of the BTO song Stayed Awake All Night, were the 3 singles from the record, all of which charted in the top 40 in the US. And speaking of charting, Headhunter peaked at number 25 on the Billboard 200 and was certified platinum status in the US as well. Not bad for a band that was strangely named after a flower? As mentioned earlier, the follow-up to Headhunter, an album known as The Blitz, is a blatant pandering to the then-current pop metal trend, and unfortunately, not a particularly great example of that genre. The musical switch might have had something to do with the band's loss of their bassist and primary songwriter, Chris Von Rohr. As is often the case, the departure of a key member can negatively affect future albums. The most recent reissue of Headhunter on vinyl would be the 2012 release from Back on Black Records on red vinyl with a gatefold, and was limited to 1,000 copies. And if you're looking to see Krokus live, you should know that in 2019, the band announced their final tour, kicking off in September of 2020, and so far, limited to North America. If you've never heard this album and had written off Krokus for any of their other material, I would highly recommend giving Headhunter a chance. It truly was lightning in a bottle for them. You might also dig their previous album, One Vice at a Time, which is almost as good, but still worth hearing. Carnivore is one of those bands that often gets overshadowed by its successor. Think Hellhammer to Celtic Frost, Elf to Rainbow, or the Amboy Dukes to Ted Nugent. Regardless, Carnivore's self-titled debut album is the rough precursor for what was to come from Peter Steele and his rather negative music. Carnivore was formed in 1983 from the remnants of founder Peter Steele's band Fallout. Although billed as a metal band, Fallout had much more in common with the punk and new wave sounds of the era. If curious about Fallout, seek out their untitled 7-inch single featuring Rock Hard and Batteries Not Included. So yes, Carnivore is what came before Typo Negative. But it might have had a lot more in common with Typo's first release than anything after that. No accident, of course, as the material on Slow, Deep, and Hard was originally written for Carnivore. Still, some of the attitude, subject matter, and occasional humor are shared by both bands, though here in a more primitive form. For the most obvious hint on this record to Steele's future band direction, check out the track Male Supremacy. And that old familiar bass distortion of his? It's here as well. Aside from that, a great deal of the more goth-inspired material of Typo hadn't surfaced yet. Rather, a more crossover thrash approach is utilized, giving this band a more rough-around-the-edges sound, likely inspired by the New York hardcore scene of the time. And the lyrics are, shall we say, pretty juvenile, to put it mildly. Recommended tracks include Carnivore, Thermonuclear Warrior, and Legion of Doom. There is some argument about whether this might be the very first crossover thrash album, though that assertion might depend on how you view DRI, who are more often given that distinction. Some would say that DRI was much more hardcore in their early years and more thrash metal later on, so there's that. And while other area thrash bands such as Overkill and Anthrax released their first records in the mid-80s, those bands lean much more metal. Again, it's an interesting assertion. But what do you think of that? Put your thoughts in the comments below. A couple major reissues for this album were released on vinyl. The first was in 2013 via Roadrunner Records as a gatefold edition with 3 bonus demo tracks and different album art. The other was issued in 2016 through Music on Vinyl, the first 1,000 of which on red vinyl. This 180-gram version also returned the original artwork to the cover. There's a lot of comedy on this album, intended or not, but it's also a decent and incredibly raw thrash classic. You should definitely hear it at least once. Hell, you might even like it. The new wave of British heavy metal scene brought us some true legends of metal. Saxon, Iron Maiden, Venom, and Bitch's Sin? Well, that last one might not be legendary, but their second album is a vast improvement from their debut effort, and on occasion has some solid metal moments. Of course, if you were to visit the primary website for this band, you'd get the impression that they were much bigger than they actually were. The claim of having produced some of the most influential heavy metal music of the 80s is as ballsy as it is wrong. Still, the album isn't without its merits. Right away, I should mention that the album is, at least, somewhat metal. For the most part, it veers into more hard rock territory, something very typical in the Nawabum scene. If you like early material from Angel Witch, Tigers of Pantang, and Diamond Head, Bitch's Sin certainly fits in musically, though they might not consistently compare in terms of quality. Highlights on the record include Invader, Dawn of Destruction, and this track, Ain't Life a Bitch.
The little girl gives you a smile, going for the kill. That little girl's got someone else, you might as well stand still. And ain't life a bitch.
My first exposure to Bitch's Sin was on the 1985 compilation album, The 12 Commandments in Metal. Yes, I know I've mentioned this Roadrunner comp more than a couple times in these videos, but it really was an important record that introduced me to a number of decent bands. And sure, I'll throw Bitch's Sin in that description too. Unfortunately, the chief problem that seemed to plague this band were the frequent lineup changes. Though a secondary goof might have been leaving neat records way too early in their career as well. Throw in a 4-year gap between their first and second albums, and Bitch's Sin's classic era would come to a close shortly after Invaders came out. Further perplexing is that there are actually 2 versions of Invaders. The US version, the one we're discussing here, has a radically different track listing than the UK version, the latter of which also having a different cover and a different lineup. Why? According to the band, they lost the master tape and had to re-record. It seems that a series of inconsistencies of all sorts might have made the difference between the success that eluded them and the meager cult status they have. To date, there has only been one vinyl reissue of Invaders. Now sold out, High Roller Records had released a 2-LP gatefold set in 2014 called The Ultimate Invaders, limited to 250 copies. 150 on purple vinyl, 100 on black. Both versions of the album are included, plus 4 bonus tracks. Other than that, the band did reform in the late aughts and released 2 full-length albums, Udu Voodoo and The Rapture. Although listed online as active, there is little evidence otherwise that the band exists beyond 2011, except that founding guitarist Ian Toomey does appear to currently have a solo career. The first official solo effort from Alice Cooper leaves behind much of the glam trappings of his former self-named band in favor of darker theatrics, amazing production, and one insane concept story. Now, there might be some of you who are confused as to whether this is Alice Cooper's first album or his 8th. In a way, it's both. When Alice Cooper, the band, broke up in the spring of 1974, Alice Cooper, the man, got to work on forming a solo band, also called Alice Cooper, but with different musicians, save for Dick Wagner, with whom he'd worked before, primarily on the $1 Billion Babies album. So it's Alice Cooper, but it's not Alice Cooper, but it's kind of Alice Cooper? Yeah, okay. At the production helm, as well as having 7 writing credits on this album, is Bob Ezrin, who'd worked with Cooper on 4 of his previous albums. At this point, Ezrin had already worked with Aerosmith and Lou Reed, and would later produce some rather big albums for Kiss and Pink Floyd. It's a relationship that's worked for producer and artist, as Ezrin's produced a total of 13 albums for Alice Cooper as of this recording. Another notable person involved with this album, or at least one track in particular, was Vincent Price. Already an icon of gothic horror on the big screen, Price was invited by Cooper to be on the album and was more than happy to take part. Price really pours on the camp on the track The Black Widow and is a true highlight of the record. Favorite songs on this album include the title track, Steven, and above all others, The Black Widow.
The horror that he'll bring, the horror of his sting, the unholiest of kings, the Black Widow. Our minds will be his toy, and every girl and boy will learn to be employed. The Black Widow.
1 month after the release of the album, Alice Cooper and Vincent Price once more worked together, this time on an hour-long TV special called Alice Cooper: The Nightmare, which theatrically showcased all of the album's tracks. The special was released on home video in 1983, but sadly was discontinued. Welcome to My Nightmare was a gamble for Alice Cooper that handsomely paid off. Peaking at number 5 on the Billboard 200 chart, as well as reaching platinum status in 1990. 3 singles were also issued: Only Women Bleed, Department of Youth, and the title track, all of which charted on Billboard's Hot 100 in 1975. There have been numerous vinyl reissues of Welcome to My Nightmare over the decades, the most recent and relevant being the 2018 release from Atlantic and distributed by Rhino on limited edition purple vinyl, and with only 6,200 copies pressed. With some ballad material and an overall presentation more suited to musical theater, this might not be the most consistently rockin' Alice Cooper record, but it's got the creepiness and horror most metal fans love, and at least on that level, it certainly comes recommended. If there's any album from Mötley Crüe that's widely considered to be their metal album, it's definitely Shout at the Devil. The sophomore effort from the Crüe was a giant leap forward in terms of production, songwriting, and delivery. Not to mention that this major label debut would be what it took to jumpstart the band's career. And of course, it pissed off a whole lot of parents too. Shout at the Devil was produced by Tom Werman, who had also produced memorable albums from Cheap Trick and Ted Nugent. Somehow, Werman brought the perfect mix, if you will, of big production sound for aggressively raw tracks. It's an unlikely pairing that works well for the record, and it really does hold up all of these years later. Despite getting nearly ignored by Elektra Records regarding promotion, Shout at the Devil still managed to go 4x platinum over time, and 3 tracks even made it to the Billboard's mainstream rock chart in 1983 and 1984. That's quite a feat back then when you consider that the hot acts of the time were Lionel Richie, Men at Work, and Thomas Dolby. I really do love this album front to back, so picking favorites is super tough. But if I have to, it's the title track, Looks That Kill, and especially Knock 'Em Dead Kid. It's fair to say that the black-on-black pentagram on the album cover was pure marketing bait, riding the controversial wave of satanic panic nonsense of the era. In the religiously and socially conservative 80s, flirtation with any assumed satanic imagery was an easy way to get attention. It certainly got my attention because that iconic album art resulted in the 15-year-old me plunking down $7.99 for the record without much thought at all. Luckily, there's also a pretty good album inside that record jacket. So given the album packaging and at least one song title, it's no surprise that the band gained the attention of concerned parents groups, such as the Parents Music Resource Center, who put the track Bastard at number 6 on their Filthy 15 list, citing violent lyrics. Of course, they're right about the lyrics, and that's why the kids loved it all the more. So thanks, PMRC. Another notable track on this album is their cover version of the Beatles' song Helter Skelter, originally made notorious by its association with Charles Manson and the murders committed by his followers in the late 1960s. The picture disc single for this cover version even shows the band in front of a blood-splattered backdrop. More effective marketing, and one of my favorite metal cover songs ever. And speaking of marketing, there were music videos from this album for Looks That Kill and Too Young to Fall in Love. Both videos showcase the whole horror glam image they had for this period of their career, and it's one that a lot of us fans found not only compelling, but just plain awesome. A few of the more notable vinyl reissues of Shout at the Devil include a 1994 picture disc from Elektra, as well as a 2016 limited edition red vinyl with black marble, 1,500 copies pressed, and a 2018 limited edition in clear with red marble, also 1,500 copies pressed. These last 2 editions were made available directly from Mötley Records. So despite all the car accidents, the snorting of Krell, the whole dying for a few minutes thing, and all the other reckless behavior, Mötley Crüe somehow managed to survive the 1980s and beyond. But from out of the vortex of all of that chaos came Shout at the Devil, a crucial cornerstone of the Mötley Crüe discography. Trust me, you should definitely own it. If you're a fan of the Vinyl Reacquisition Project, you'll definitely want to pick up an official VRP t-shirt. Log on to the website listed below for ordering details and get yours today. So apologies for not having an episode out in December. My day job basically had me working 25 days in a row, and I just didn't have time for a show that otherwise takes me 40 plus hours to produce end to end. So going forward, I wouldn't expect an episode of the Vinyl Reacquisition Project in December, so keep that in mind. But you will still have other shows and specials in that month, so you'll definitely have something to watch each and every Monday. And as always, if you enjoy this program, you should definitely like and share the video. Share all the videos. They're great stuff. Also, if you haven't already done so, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you can get messages on each and every video that I produce. Good stuff. You should do it. Also, if you want to support this network in a more financial sense, definitely check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/theaccusationnetwork. Check out the tiers, see how you can contribute. I would definitely appreciate your support. And as always, see you next month.